Hey folks, Eddie from Totally Wired Guitars here, and I am super excited because today we are going to be doing our deep dive review of Fender's brand new Vintera III Mid 60s Mustang. Now, before we get started, I want to thank the kind folks over at Zounds for sending this along with the rest of the Vintera III offsets to me on loan for review. So without further ado, let's get into it. So if you've been paying attention to the channel, you will know that very quickly over the past year and some change, the Fender Mustang has quickly become one of my favorite offsets, and it didn't always used to be that way. All of the deep dives that I've been doing in my own personal projects as well as vintage restorations has resulted in a much finer appreciation for this younger sibling of the much more popular Jazzmaster and Jaguar guitars. Now, when I first caught wind of the Vintera III leaks, the Mustang in particular excited me because we had never seen Fender Mexico or even Fender USA for that matter do a proper reissue of the earliest of the 60s Mustangs. And so this here, the mid 60s Mustang, is supposed to be an homage to about 1964 or so, when the Mustang first came out. Starting off with the specs, the Vintera III Mustang comes with an alder body as well as a maple neck, amber tinted, much like the rest of the Vintera series. It also comes with an Indian rosewood fretboard, and for the first time on a made in Mexico Mustang, we are seeing actual clay dot inlays. This neck also features an actual bone nut this time around, getting rid of the synthetic bone nut. And as I've said in my other reviews, Fender has applied the decal over the finish this time around in order to lean more into that overall vintage aesthetic. This is how they used to do them back in the day, and it's also how the American Vintage series does them as well. Now, continuing with the neck, the Vintera III Mustang features a 7¼ radius as well as vintage tall frets, which, in case you don't know, is only about 5/1000ths of an inch or so taller than vintage frets. On average, about 45/1000ths of an inch tall, whereas vintage frets that you might find on an actual vintage Mustang are usually, if they are still in their stock condition, about 40/1000ths of an inch tall. So yeah, not that big of a difference, and definitely not as much of a difference as compared to what people mix up or think are the same kind of fret, which are the narrow tall frets, which are about 55/1000ths of an inch tall. This also features a 1.65 inch or 42 millimeter nut width, as well as what Fender is calling a mid 60s C shape as compared to my Vintera II Mustang back there. The neck on this, to me, upon first impression, feels a bit thicker, a bit rounder and fuller overall, but we definitely are going to get out the calipers in a bit here and compare the neck thicknesses at the 1st and 12th frets between the two models. One interesting detail here is that the Rosewood fretboard on here, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see, is a round laminate Rosewood board, and in fact, quite a bit thicker than your typical round lamb Rosewood fretboard. Upon first glance, I thought it was slab because of how thick it was. But yeah, this is a feature that was implemented on Mustangs starting around 1965 or so. Prior to that, the early 65 and also 64 Mustangs all came with slab rosewood fretboards. Now, one other detail that Fender decided to pay homage to from the earliest Mustangs is these white oval button tuners, reminiscent of the old Kluson tuners from back in the day. They also feature a single line Fender logo, and I have discovered that these tuners are made by Ping out in Taiwan. They are very high quality tuners, especially as compared even to the previous iteration featured on both the Vintera II as well as the Vintera I models. As I said in my Vintera III Jazzmaster review, if I were blindfolded, I honestly would probably not be able to tell the difference between these and my personal favorite reissue vintage style tuners, which are the Goto SD91s. Now, moving on to the hardware, I don't believe there's really going to be any change to the actual hardware aside from the aesthetics. Here you can see that they have the patent pending tremolo base plate here, whereas it had the patent numbers on the Vintera II 70s model, and it also features the same Mustang bridge from last time, which unfortunately does have the 56 millimeter string spacing that makes your low E and your high E dangerously close, at least for some players, to the edge of the fretboard. I've found that while that looks a bit alarming, that in practice, especially because I have been playing offsets for the better part of the past 20 years or so, most of the vintage guitars, Mustangs, and offsets that I've put vintage Mustang bridges on, all of those, including the Fender Japan models from the 90s and the 2000s, all featured this same 56 millimeter string spacing bridge. So for me personally, and because I also do not spend a lot of time in the upper registers, this doesn't seem to be that big of a problem for me. But that said, dropping in a 52 millimeter string spacing bridge, such as my favorite bridge currently, the Offset Guitars UK offset bridge, would definitely help to address the strings being too close to the edge of the fretboard. Now, moving on to the electronics, there were some big changes that happened this time around as compared to both the Vintera I and II. And namely, the most noticeable change is the featuring of cloth-covered, colored wiring harnesses in here that are vintage accurate. They also still feature the same 250K CTS pots, as well as your Switchcraft three-way slide switches up at the top here. And Fender also lists these pickups as mid-60s Mustang pickups. They sounded like good vintage style Mustang pickups that I very likely would not be itching to swap out if I were to personally own this guitar. A lot of users had hoped, much like the early reviews that featured the Vintera III Jaguar as well as the Vintera III Jazzmaster, that the Mustang was also going to feature the conductive shielding paint in all of the cavities underneath the pick guard and underneath the control plate. But unfortunately, a lot of people who have purchased these guitars or gotten them for review have already verified that this model does not come with that shielding. And I did touch on this in the Jazzmaster review, just basically stating fact. I unfortunately don't think that the conductive shielding paint that they're putting in the Jaguar or Jazzmaster even have enough layers of said paint to get positive continuity, and therefore, in my personal opinion, are literally there just for aesthetics and aren't really doing that much to help reduce noise. You've got an incomplete Faraday cage, and I am not expecting there to be shielding underneath this pick guard either. If you own this guitar and want to do your best to tame down any interference and noise, and maybe address a little bit of the 60 cycle hum that might be coming from your pickups when each pickup is isolated, then you definitely want to use either more conductive shielding paint, build up enough layers until you get positive continuity, or do what I always do and use conductive shielding tape, the copper foil type that you can get either from StewMac or Amazon or whatever. Just be warned that it is going to be a little bit challenging. I find that whatever coating or paint that they've used in here is really resistant to adhesives on the top, and even after vacuuming and cleaning out cavities with naphtha and such, I still have found it to be challenging. And so you may very well need to use something like a clear, even just school glue to actually get your shielding tape to stick. Now, first impressions of this thing out of the box were that overall it played pretty good. I wasn't too critical of the setup during that first impressions video, but upon looking a bit more closely, I can definitely tell that the action here is a bit higher than I personally would like on both the bass and treble side. If I get out my Fret Guru XT here, if I am measuring at the 12th fret, I am getting roughly 8/64ths at the low E string. And then on the high E string, I am getting right about 7.5/64ths. Now, I personally, depending on the condition of the frets and how much relief is in the fretboard, prefer to have my setups so that both figures are under 2 millimeters. So yeah, definitely when this hits the bench, we are going to have to do some dialing in. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do the nerdy stuff that we love to do on this channel and crack this thing open and see what's going on under the hood. And then after that, we are going to do a setup on this, and I'm going to share my overall notes and findings of the setup process. And then we are going to plug it in to the old Princeton Reverb Reissue as always, and give you some sound demos before sharing with you my final thoughts and opinions on the Vintera III mid-60s Mustang. All right, my friends, so we are back from the bench, and I just wanted to share with you a couple of the setup notes. For the most part, it was the same bog standard setup that I have done for a floating vibrato on pretty much every Mustang that I have featured on this channel so far. If you want to see a deep dive on how to properly set your Mustang vibrato, whether it be on your Squier or your Fender Japan or your Vintera or even vintage Mustang, I've got two different videos, why your Mustang plays like and then the other one goes over how to calibrate and properly set up a Squier Mustang vibrato for floating. Both cover the process in detail. This time around, actually, though, I did find an easier way to create the little nylon discs that I've been making using an actual hole punch intended for leather and a sheet of PTFE, which is basically like a nylon or Teflon kind of material that was 1 millimeter thick. That created very, very quickly, a lot easier than trying to hand cut one out with scissors, and that fit and was sandwiched in between the set screw in the cigar here and the vibrato arm. And you can see that I am able to move this without getting those annoying grinding noises and without it immediately becoming floppy right away. So that is definitely a mod that I would highly recommend doing, or finding some nylon tipped M5 set screws to help address that annoying issue that is common on pretty much all modern Mustangs and not just the Vintera III. Now, one thing that I experienced on this that I did also experience even on my Vintera II 70s Mustang was that the springs that they are using were not actually crimped to attach and hang on to the cigar posts. So when I had tried to make adjustments to that and tried to get away with not crimping the ends of those springs, as soon as I turned the guitar over, they fell right back out again. I guess ideally what Fender was thinking in that process was that once you have the guitar under string tension, that they will stay in place. Maybe if you are very, very careful after putting the tremolo back on, and then immediately tighten the tuners back up so that you have string tension again, then maybe they will not fall off for the rest of your setup. But I did end up having to crimp the ends of those. And on the setup for this particular Mustang, because I'm using these stock 10 to 46 gauge strings here, I did end up having to move that spring to the topmost rung, the rung that is closest to the vibrato faceplate here. And that was because when I had it set to the lowest rung, and there's only two rungs on the cigar post for this, the tension on these springs was a bit too much. And then also the other thing that I noticed is that the arm, the construction of the arm here is actually a bit different from that of the 70s. It doesn't have as extreme of a bend upwards, and I do think the length of the arm too is a bit different. So if you take a look at this one, right, and then take a look from the side, you can see that it's almost parallel, which is what we are going for on the setup of these. And then you compare it to the Vintera 70s Mustang, you can see that this arm is definitely, it looks a tiny bit longer where the tip meets the bend in the arm. And so I'm seeing a bit more extreme of a bend here, and it may just be a little bit longer. That also changes the feel of the tremolo somewhat. I did need to have it slightly tilt backwards because when the cigar was set perfectly perpendicular to the top, I didn't have enough spring tension. And then when I had it set again to the bottommost rung of the vibrato cigar posts, then I ended up having too much tension and just really didn't feel responsive. So it took many iterations and back and forth trial and error for me to get this thing playing and feeling right. And now, thankfully, it is staying in tune and it feels really nice and responsive. Another interesting detail that I found here is that unlike the other Vintera offsets that we've looked at so far, this one seems to actually have the normal size thimbles. These are not the same tiny thimbles that we have seen on the other, the Bass 6 and the Jazzmaster so far. So that is very interesting to see indeed. I'm not sure if that coincides with the fact that this is the only model that we've seen so far that has a Mustang bridge versus a threaded saddle style bridge. And maybe the posts on this bridge are a tiny bit thicker than the other posts. I'm really unsure about that, but that is a curious finding. You definitely can drop in one of those 7¼ radius American Pro bridges, aka the Johnny Marr / Troy Van Leeuwen bridge that Fender sells as an aftermarket part. Essentially, the Stay Trem clone will fit in there. So that is fascinating. This is the only model in the Vintera III offset lineup that actually has the full-size thimbles. Also, while we were under the hood, we definitely confirmed that there unfortunately is no shielding at all in these cavities. The only place that there is shielding underneath this pickguard is underneath the switches up here. Now, the interesting thing is, on my 66 Mustang back there, and pretty much every Mustang, vintage Mustang that I've worked on, there was no shielding underneath the pickguard anyway, but those did have the brass shielding plates in all of the cavities. Now, as I had mentioned before, the setup from the factory was okay, but definitely could be better, and we were able to dial the action in the end down to below 2 millimeters from the top of the 12th fret to the bottom of the low and high E strings. So it is a really nice, comfortable action. Now, I did actually have to shim the neck to be able to get my bridge to sit at that, 3 millimeters that I typically like between the base of the bridge and the top of the vibrato plate. And I ended up using the equivalent, if you use those full pocket neck shims, of a 0.5 degree shim, and that gave me the ability to dial in a nice feeling low action. Now, thankfully, in addition to the fact that this does not have any fret sprout and just has a really nice, comfortable rolled edge feel to it, when checking for high frets, I only ended up finding a few across the board, which are not contributing dramatically to any kind of fret buzz here. I was still able to dial in the action low, and overall it plays very cleanly across the entire fretboard. Checking the nut slots were done pretty decently overall here. I had found that on the bass side, they were cut to an average of about 25 thousandths of an inch, and on the treble side, they were cut to an average of about 20 thousandths of an inch, which is very close to what I typically like to do. I usually do about 20 thousandths of an inch for the bass strings, and a little below 17 thousandths of an inch on the treble strings. So that was very nice to see. It took many rounds of string stretching because we were experimenting with how much spring tension we needed in the setup of our cigar. And then finally, after getting the strings properly stretched, we finished off by adding lubrication where the cigar posts meet the knife edge of the vibrato plate, as well as at the nut slots. Thankfully, with these stock strings, I was not getting any kind of binding or any sitar noises from the way that the nut was cut. So again, very, very nice to see that the quality control on this particular Vintera III Mustang was fairly good out of the box. A couple more findings that we found under the hood. While this has the patent pending stamp, the construction of particularly the cigar post, is not vintage accurate because the post here did have 2 rungs instead of the single rung that a true patent pending unit would have had. And in my personal opinion, that's actually a good thing. I'm glad that they had 2 different rungs for me to dial in the spring tension to taste, especially because depending on the string gauge that you use, you are definitely going to want that adjustability. Now, despite not having shielding, it was nice to see that this, like the rest of the Vintera III lineup, does have your full-size CTS pots. This has 250K pots for both the volume and tone. You've got your Switchcraft 3-way slide switches up here with that colored cloth covered wiring harness, and it was all done very well, which again is really, really nice to see, especially on a mid-tier model. Now, one last thing that I wanted to check here that I didn't do while it was on the bench is the actual neck thickness that we have at both the 1st and the 12th fret. My first impressions were that this was definitely a slightly fuller C shape than the Vintera II 70s model that I own. And so at the 1st fret here, we are getting a reading of about 0.85 at the 1st fret, 0.85 inches, or for our metric friends, that is 21.67 millimeters. And then at the 12th fret, we are getting roughly 0.925 inches, or 23.72 millimeters. Now, comparing that to the Vintera II, I'm also getting right around 0.83 inches at the 1st fret, 0.835 to be precise, and that comes to 21.22 millimeters. And then at the 12th fret, we've got 0.905 millimeters. So definitely a bit slimmer at the 12th fret, and that comes to about 23-ish millimeters, 23.05. I might have accidentally moved it. So right around that point. While it's not an extravagant difference, I definitely can feel that the Vintera II here has a bit less shoulder and is overall slimmer up here in the higher registers. So folks who like a fuller neck are definitely going to dig the Vintera III Mustang. One additional detail that I have seen some folks pointing out and to an extent complaining about is the placement of the Mustang decal here looking a bit wonky, and I definitely agree with those folks. Take a look at how close the Mustang logo there is to the B tuning machine. I have never really seen them like this, especially with this headstock shape. This is the same headstock shape that they have on the 66 that I have. And if you take a look at the logo placement on an actual 1966 Mustang, you can see that the Fender logo is pushed way further back, right? And you can see that the Mustang logo is not nearly as high. If you compare the two of them side by side, you can see that definitely the one on the Vintera III does look a tiny bit wonky. I imagine because the decal is sitting over the finish here, that this might not be the case on every single unit that's out there. So definitely let me know if you got a Vintera III Mustang, if your decal is wonkily placed like this one. All right, so with all of the nerdy stuff out of the way, it's time to plug this thing in and hear what it sounds like. We are going to start off with a 3-way shootout between the pickups in the Vintera III versus the Vintera II versus an actual 1966 Mustang, just to nerd out to the max here. And then from there, we're going to go through and do our various demos on all the different positions through the trusty old Princeton Reverb Reissue. Now, there definitely were some differences, but not as huge among the three different guitars. If anything, I do feel like these, as compared to the Vintera II, are a bit brighter, a little bit thinner sounding, definitely not as full and beefy, especially in the lows and the lower mids that we were getting from the Vintera II Mustang. And I feel like this was still a little bit brighter than the actual vintage 1966 Mustang. Surprisingly, I actually like the out of phase tone from both the Vintera III as well as the Vintera II better than on the actual vintage 66 Mustang, because it just sounded a lot weaker than these newer models. But overall, I do like the pickups in these. And I would say overall, they do pay homage very well to that mid-60s era. All right, we are back on our bridge pickup now. Settings are still clean, right around 5 on the volume on the Princeton Reverb. All right, we are now in the middle position with both pickups in parallel, and we've turned the amp up to about 7.5 on the volume so that we can get a bit more of that tube overdrive kicking in. I'm happy to report that we have barely had to do any kind of tuning in between the various riffs. It is staying perfectly in tune with the way that we have it set up right now. So that is definitely nice. All right, we are on the neck pickup. We've turned the amp down slightly back to around 5.5. And now both pickups out of phase. Both pickups in parallel. We have turned up the amp once again for some more overdrive, and we've kicked up the reverb. All right, so there we have it, my friends. Wow. I am definitely impressed by the Vintera III. mid 60s Mustang. I really, really love this. Something that I didn't mention actually from the top is that this is probably one of the lightest weight Mustangs that I've had, lighter than my actual vintage 1966. It is a great playing guitar, right on par with my Vintera II 70s Mustang, because I really held that one in very, very high regard. The pluses here, no doubt, are the fact that the fit and finish on this is a bit better than the Vintera II Mustang. Obviously, we also have your premium cloth covered wiring in your circuit. And I do quite like these Clusen style white button tuners for whatever reason, despite the fact that I said that the F style white button tuners on the Vintera II 70s Mustang were pretty decent. I just find that F tuners overall, when compared to Clusens, are just almost always worse. And that is just my personal opinion. It might be different for you, but I just feel that they do not turn as smoothly and they're not as easy to tune as these ones. So that is another nice touch. Of course, here we also have the bone nut. It's staying in tune very nicely. It's a pleasure to play up and down the neck. We're not getting any fret sprout or anything, and it just sounds and feels and plays great. Now, who is this Mustang for? I would definitely say that if you have a Squier Classic Vibe Mustang and have fallen in love and have been looking for a more premium option, but that isn't too expensive, then the Vintera III Mustang is definitely right up your alley and you should strongly be considering it. The Vintera II Mustangs, the truth is some folks are not into the competition stripe. That is an aesthetic choice that obviously is up to you. And despite the fact that the Vintera II 70s Mustang came in some really cool colors, this is a return to form. Some folks want a Mustang that is styled more closely to the original Mustangs from the earliest years, like 1964, 1965, slab body, the classic colors like this Sonic Blue, which to be honest with you, looks a bit more like the classic Daphne Blue to my eyes. These also came in Dakota Red as well as Olympic White with a tortoiseshell pickguard and white plastics on that model. So if that is you, then the Vintera III Mustang is definitely a great choice. Now, if you already have an original Vintera 60s Mustang with the Pau Ferro fretboards, if you have been looking for a Mustang that feels pretty comparable overall with improved electronics as well as a slightly slimmer feel to the neck, then this is definitely a good choice. And again, we have Rosewood for those of you who aren't into Pau Ferro. If you have a Vintera II 70s Mustang already, unless you are a completist, I feel like this is kind of a hard sell, especially if you got the Vintera II 70s Mustang during their President's Day blowout where they were selling them for, I think, as cheap as like $700 or $800, which is a steal, honestly, for that particular Mustang. I think the pickups on the Vintera II Mustang are really good and definitely a bit fuller, a bit beefier in sound. There is enough differences between the two models that if you are a huge Mustang fan, you totally can justify having both in your personal collection. Now, how does this compare to the Fender Japan Mustangs, of which I have owned almost every single iteration? I would say that my favorite reissue Mustang of all time is probably the Fender Japan 1965 reissue. And I would say that this compares fairly favorably. I still think that the Fender Japan model was better. I still think that the pickups in those were a bit more true to actual 60s Mustang pickups. Those also had the brass shielding plates and also had cloth covered wiring throughout. And just the fit and finish, it's hard to debate this, but Fender Japan, especially from that, you know, later 2000s, early 2010s era, is indisputable. And if you can find one of those, which I see in the aftermarket on places like Reverb and eBay, those tend to go for around $1,200 to $1,400 or so. So if you are looking for an even more vintage accurate reissue, then you cannot go wrong with the Fender Japan 65 reissue Mustangs. Now, one last thing that I want to say is that this definitely took a bit of dialing in on the bench to get playing right. And all too often in my comment sections, in the comments and forums all over the internet, I see people saying that these suck, just go for Fender Japan, just go for vintage, and so on and so forth. And to be honest, many of those folks are basing their opinions without ever having played the actual Vintera III Mustang. Either that or they're basing their opinions on made in Mexico guitars in general, which I think is unfair because they definitely have made strides over the years. They are definitely very different beasts, especially if you are someone like me who was a kid coming up in the 90s. These are a significant upgrade in quality from a lot of those made in Mexico standard models. And I will even go on to say that these are even an improvement over some of those classic series offsets that I have played over the years that for whatever reason, in my personal opinion, there was just something, despite them being perfect on paper, there were just things in the fit and finish and the overall feel, even after a good setup, that just never quite sat right with me. And so take what you see, including this review, with a grain of salt because they're all just opinions, right? And remember that Fender produces thousands of these instruments, right? And the one comment where they're basing their opinion fully on playing one of these at a big box shop where they don't give a crap about how they are set up and just put them on the floor with absolutely no maintenance or care or anything into how they feel. I just think that if you base your opinion on that, or even on what the guitar feels like right out of the box, and I know that we should hold these companies to a higher standard, but at this point in time, I'm just being realistic with you all. You are going to need to put in a little bit of work, or your tech is going to have to put it in to dial these things in to be the best they can be, because they might be playable out of the box, but if you really want them to feel their best and to like reach its full potential, it is going to take a bit of extra attention. It's very clear, at least on this unit, that the quality control has improved and that the overall fit and finish out of the box is better than what I've seen in more recent years. And I just think that anyone who ends up getting this that does dial it in a little bit more precisely to your needs is going to be super happy with it. Anyway, that's going to do it for today's video. I hope you found it enjoyable as well as informative, especially if you've had your eyes on this new Fender Vintera III mid-60s Mustang. And if you are looking to pick one of these up for yourself, I highly recommend you use the affiliate links down below from our sponsor, Zounds. Zounds has routinely been one of my favorite retailers out there, especially because they make splitting up the gear that you want and need now into manageable payments, absolutely interest-free, so easy and accessible. There is no lengthy application process, no background check, no credit check. They don't even need your social security number, and their customer service is second to none, in my opinion. And if you end up using those affiliate links down below, it helps out the channel immensely. It costs you nothing extra. So thank you in advance to all of you who consider using those. Now, if you bought one of these on launch day or have already gotten yours and have been playing it for a little while now, I would definitely love to hear your thoughts and experiences down in the comments below. I know that that is very, very valuable information to everybody who is considering picking one of these up. And I would especially love to hear from the folks who have owned other Mustangs in the past, whether that's the Vintera II or the original Vintera 60s or any of the Fender Japan reissue models or even vintage, how you think this new Vintera III stacks up. As always, if you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars, buying, and setup tips.